Hello and welcome to another episode of History Hack. I could try and do a professional introduction to this episode, but the fact of the matter is that right now Alina is sitting somewhere in Poland under house arrest, squealing with her microphone on mute. So I'm just going to let her do it. I'm going to let her introduce even our guest for today. Alina, who is with us?
So, ladies and gentlemen, I'm honoured to have on our podcast today the fabulous historian Roger Moorhouse. He has published some best-selling books about the Berlin Wall, Hitler-Stalin Pact, but primarily he's here to talk about his newest book, First to Fight, about the 1939 September campaign and the invasion of Poland. Welcome, Roger. We're really pleased to have you.
Hello, Lena. Hello, Alex. Nice to be here.
So how are you getting on, Roger? First of all, whereabouts are you calling us from?
I'm in Hertfordshire, sunny Hertfordshire.
Oh, okay, so we've had a few London.
I'm all right. I'm doing fine, actually.
Yeah,
not far from London. I'm absolutely fine because it's funny. Being locked down like everyone is. It's kind of a bit like my life. So it's kind of normal, really. I sit in my office and I do my thing, and people sort of moaning about social isolation, and I say, well, it's just what it's like to be an author, to be honest with you. So,
this is the thing, isn't it? I'm sitting there watching Boris's announcement the other day going, you will not go outside unless it's to find food, and you will not hang around with other people in large groups and have any fun. And I'm like, that's basically my life. Most of the people we hang out with are dead anyway, so... Yeah, it's very little adjustment for a historian / author.
It's very true.
Yeah,
it's very true.
We've got to ask you about this because last Monday we had Guy Walters on. What is this about his lawnmower and you coming to the rescue? And I think he's actually irritated with you for coming to the rescue because it meant he actually did have to cut the grass. But did you seriously have to remotely fix his lawnmower for him?
Well, I gently gave him some advice on how he might fix his lawnmower. He said on, I think it was on Sunday that he was trying to do the lawn and the lawnmower wasn't working, and I very gently said maybe you want to put some fresh fuel in it, and he shot back and said don't talk about things you know nothing about. And I said, well, I said I did have a BTEC in motor engineering at one point in another life, which he couldn't believe. So anyway, so kind of batted it around like that. And I think the fundamental problem here with people like Guy, Guy's a lovely chap, he's a good mate, but he's as an ex-Etonian, I think he's unused to doing anything with his hands. So certainly getting them dirtied by fixing things like lawnmowers.
Are you saying his butler's in self-isolation and therefore this is why he's...
I think that might be the problem. I think that might be the problem. His gardener, his man... they're all in self-isolation, and now he has to do all the dirty jobs himself, unfortunately.
Oh, I do have to say, someone who wrote a book on Eton, lay off for the OEs. But it's kind of very funny. I mean, it did make me laugh. It's like, how many historians does it take to fix a lawnmower? But the answer is actually only one if he's got any common sense.
Only one.
Anyway, let's talk history.
We are talking a bit of history. So what we actually want to know is a bit more about your book. How did you come up with the idea? But before, just a little bit before we get to that point, I just want to tell everybody that you've got to read chapter 8. Chapter 8, best chapter.
Is it really Alina, is this the one that's about your great-grandfather?
It is. Roger writes about my great-grandfather, and I love it. I absolutely love it. So he was a general in charge of the defence of Lwów, General Władysław Langner, and Roger writes a lot about him. So obviously, when I bought the book, that's the first chapter I went to. I just went straight to it. It started with me. I was like, oh my god, how amazing is this? This is so cool. And I just could not. It was a total geeky fan moment. Yes.
Alina, can I break something to you?
No.
The German invasion of Poland in 1939 was not all about you. No, that's great. That's great that your great-grandfather is in it. But we'll get to that. Guy, definitely we want you to tell us why this moment in World War II.
Guy or Roger? Well,
sorry, Guy. Roger, because you talked about Guy. That really offensive to you.
Yeah, no, that's fine. This was the last book I did. The last big book was 2014, was The Devil's Alliance, about the Nazi-Soviet Pact. and which is very, I think, completely misunderstood episode in the history of the war, and generally it's kind of not really understood at all, I think, in the British narrative. But I kind of with doing that book, the sort of the big glaring gap that made me see much more clearly was the September campaign, which is another one that I think is an episode that we don't really understand very well in the Western narrative of the war. There's lots of sort of mythology around it, and which is still battered around today and repeated in ignorance. And even, I mean, you just I'm not having a go at you, obviously. We all have our areas of specialism, but Alex, you just said just now, the German invasion of Poland in 39, and on that, you're right, but there were two invasions of Poland in 39, the Germans and the Soviets, right? So this is one of those key things that we have to sort of remind ourselves at every turn. It's not just the Germans in 39, it's not just the Germans who are the bad guys in 39 either. So
I do have to confess to you, Roger, that 6 months ago I was still referring to this as the Allo Allo War. So,
right, yeah, she did. She was. It's deeply embarrassing.
Yeah, about a year ago, if it wasn't in an episode of Band of Brothers, or it wasn't in Allo Allo, then I would never have heard of it. So, let's give you some questions from people who actually know what they're talking about, because we've had lots. Alina, who was first?
Okay.
So Shane, our War Gen guy, which we all know, Shane asks, is it true that the Polish government in exile published a white paper giving a general view of Poland's relations with Germany between 1933 and 1939 that included the revelation that Hitler tried to involve Poland in a plot to attack the Soviet Union?
Right. There's some a little bit mixed up there. There's what's called the White Book, which was published by the Polish government in exile as part of their effectively sort of propaganda campaign during the war. I think it was published in 1942, which was exactly what he just described, was a collection of documents of German-Polish relations between 1933 and 1939. And it's very useful. I've got it on my shelves behind me. It's a very useful document. But then the other thing that he's describing there is a little bit confused. The Poles actually considered making a preemptive attack on Germany in 1933, and this was sort of discussed, and eventually sort of thought against it, because when Hitler comes to power, and they think this is the time to maybe nip things in the bud, but they decided against for various reasons. So I think that's probably what he's referring to, but in a slightly mixed up way. And then later on in 1939, as part of the German effort to kind of essentially destabilize Poland, but also to try and shake it away from its Western, not yet alliances, but its Western alignments. The Germans also suggested joining forces with them to attack the Soviet Union, but that's in 1939. But the fundamental of this is that Poland's position in between the wars is very much one. It's the worst place in the world, effectively. You've got Hitler on one side and Stalin on the other after 1933. So it's pretty much in the 1930s the worst place in the world to be. So consequently, Poland's foreign policy in that time is quite a difficult balancing act, and the policy they had effectively was to not sort of make deals and treaties and so on with either side. They weren't going to align themselves with either side, to try and sort of maintain that balance. So it's a very, very difficult situation they were in. So that kind of answers Shane's question, I hope. But the question was a little bit mixed up, but hopefully that makes it make more sense.
No, completely. I mean, we've got a couple of other questions that I'm going to let Alex take a little bit of some question taking. So go for it.
I think you're right, Roger, in the sense that if there's one place you want to be in history, least of all, it's in a Hitler-Stalin sandwich. But
absolutely,
yeah, Adam Zukov would like to know. He says Stalin attended the signing of the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact, but Hitler didn't. Why did Stalin go, but Hitler didn't? Are there ramifications unseen in each man's decision? Is it nothing more than the meeting took place in Moscow? He says it's weird to him that Stalin allowed the photo.
Right. Yeah, and that's a good point. There's lots of photos of the signing of the Nazi-Soviet Pact, August 23rd, 39. Sorry, with Stalin smiling very, very happily, having signed the pact with Ribbentrop. Hitler's foreign minister went to Moscow to do it. I think the bottom line in this question is yes, he also kind of answers his own question in a way. I think the fundamental reason that Hitler doesn't go is because it's done in Moscow. Ribbentrop flies to Moscow. He gets the green light from Stalin to go and negotiate stuff. A lot of the groundwork of the negotiation had already been done remotely. And then he gets the green light to go and sort of cross the T's and dot the I's, which he goes and does, and that happens in the Kremlin. And it is significant that Stalin turns up at all. For example, the German foreign minister von der Schulenburg was there as well, was in that group in the Kremlin, and he'd been German foreign minister in Moscow for something like 4 or 5 years by that point. And he'd never actually seen Stalin in the flesh. He'd never been with Stalin in the same room. So Stalin was quite a sort of elusive character. And for him to actually be there and be leading the negotiations, which he was, is quite significant. So this was Stalin's policy. It's quite an interesting point. It's called the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact. It should really be called the Hitler-Stalin Pact, Nazi-Soviet Pact, I call it. But it's very much Stalin's signature policy, although he let his foreign minister kind of attach his name to it. So yeah, that aspect is significant, but the fact that Hitler isn't there is much more just to do with geography and logistics, I would suggest.
Just reminding our viewers, Roger's book is called The Devil's Alliance, Hitler's Pact with Stalin, which is what he's just mentioned in how he calls it, not the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact, but the Hitler-Stalin Pact.
I do, yes.
So let's move on to some other questions. I mean, we've got a few on the Hitler-Stalin Pact. Let's get that right. Models TPS asks, how important was the Soviet-Nazi Pact signature prior to the invasion? Yeah. Was it the reason for the delay from an August to September invasion?
Yeah, again, that's slightly mixed up chronology in the question. So the Nazi-Soviet Pact is signed on the 23rd of August, 1939. And then there is a response. So the Poles respond by basically looking for concrete foreign alliances, and they already have a commitment from the British and a commitment from the French, but they look to sort of solidify those a bit more. And on the 25th of August, so 2 days later, there is the signature of the Anglo-Polish military agreement, which is essentially a response to the Nazi-Soviet Pact, right? And it's that military arrangement with the British that forces Hitler to delay his attack on Poland. He'd originally planned to attack Poland, I think, at dawn on the 26th of August, so the following day. And the signature of that pact with the British meant that he delayed it until the 1st of dawn on the 1st of September, because he wanted to see whether there would be any fallout, whether Mussolini would come in with him. He wanted to sort of, see whether he could isolate the Poles any further. Just see how that sort of changed the kaleidoscope of relations in that last week of August. It didn't much, so he attacked then on 1st of September. So it's not necessarily the pact that forces the delay, it's the Anglo-Polish response to the pact, if that makes sense.
Can I move away from that just to ask you? We had a really interesting question come in from Monsieur, and he asked, and I really want to know the answer to this, can I ask why Poland and the Poles were so despised and victimised by the Germans and the Russians? I would suspect there's no quick answer to that, but can you give us a sense?
Wow. Yeah, I mean, we have to be a bit careful, I suppose, of overplaying that. We don't want to sort of cause an international incident between those three countries. Certainly not these days. I mean, relations with the Germans, the Poles are generally pretty good. Not so great with the Russians, but that's another question for another day. But certainly historically speaking, yeah, and there was a good degree of sort of contempt, certainly. The German relationship with the Poles is an interesting one because it's a little bit like the British relationship with the Irish in a strange way. So the Germans tended to look down on the Poles. They tended to view them as their sort of country cousins who were a bit primitive and a bit stupid. And it was very much that sort of, they wanted to civilize them, in inverted commas. So they wanted to make them Germans, like we wanted to make the Irish British in that sense. So it's kind of, in the 19th century, it's kind of a similar relationship in that sense. So the Germans saw themselves as being sort of, innately superior to the Poles. And the Poles are a very, proud nation with a proud culture and proud traditions and all the rest of it. Great history behind them as well. And of course, the 19th century Poland wasn't on the map. It's been partitioned by its big neighbours. Disappears between 1795 and 1918. So that is the essence of that original German kind of not really contempt is too strong a word, but it certainly looked down on the Poles. And then if you jump forward to the 1930s and the Hitler and the Nazis in power, then there's a much stronger real Polonophobia that comes out of that, and that's basically because Poland basically is reformed in 1918 and takes territory that the Germans considered to be wholly German. So there's a real contempt that kicks in there, and crucially with the Germans as well, it's kind of biological. It's kind of, these people are Poles and they are biologically doomed, So it's a very different element from the old-fashioned kind of, the Germans looking down their noses at the Poles. So that is kind of that hopefully makes a bit of sense of that one. And in terms of the Russian relationship with the Poles is also a difficult one. And it's very, rooted very deeply in the history. If you go back to 1610, for example, the Poles actually, at this point, Poland is one of the largest, most powerful states in Europe. And the Poles actually go and sack Moscow in 1610. And this was never forgotten. This is the advent, actually, when the Romanovs come to power. This is the beginning of the Romanov period. And that was never forgotten in Moscow, that the Poles came and sort of desecrated the Russian capital. And then going forward, Russia grows in power as Poland then weakens in power in the 18th century, particularly. You've got the partitions. Then in the 19th century, got Polish risings, successive risings, mainly against Russian rule, also against German rule as well, but mainly against the Russians. So the Russians kind of view the Poles as, again, as sort of, inveterate troublemakers. They're just people who are, forever frustrating Russian ambition. They're always in the way. They're always causing a problem. And then again, you jump forward to the 1930s and you've got a new regime coming in with communism, which adds a whole new veneer of ideology to that traditional, rivalry and contempt in a way. And of course, the Poles block the Soviet expansion westwards in 1920 at the Battle of the Vistula. So, there's all sorts of historic reasons why there was, a real tension, to put it very lightly, a real tension between those three capitals, between Moscow, Warsaw, and Berlin, and that all kind of, essentially crystallizes in 1939.
This is actually a little bit down my line of work, which is why I find this question really interesting. It's about, obviously, Poland and World War II, but is there any information on Jewish involvement in the Polish military up to the invasion? And is there any evidence of anti-Semitism in the Polish military at the time? And that's asked by Holocaust Reader. Okay.
Yeah, I mean, the Polish Republic, as it's reformed in 1918, is, essentially by definition, it expands, and it expands both eastwards and westwards. It takes a lot of those disputed territories from both Germany and from the Soviet Union, and fall from Russia. So it ends up, as it's reformed in 1918, after 1918, as a multinational state. And there is a sort of a paradox there, because it's been reformed and it's the heir to all of that sort of Polish tradition and all of that. It's regained its independence after 123 years in the wilderness when it wasn't present on the map. Poland's sort of ruling ethos is actually quite nationalistic, and yet it is a multinational state. So there's an inherent tension there in the Second Republic between 1918 and 39. And there is a large Jewish population as well. So there are sort of ethnic tensions within the Second Polish Republic. That certainly is true. And again, the Polish army has all of those nationalities, Jews as well, Belarusians, Ukrainians, Germans even, all conscripted and all sort of within the army structure. So, they are all there, and it would be a fool who would say, no, of course, relations were always rosy and there was never a problem. there were problems, as there were across the world. You have to bear in mind that, it's easy to point the finger at the Germans and say that, that regime was horribly anti-Semitic, and it absolutely was. But anti-Semitism is not just a German disease in the 1930s. It's represented right across Europe and elsewhere, and in America and everywhere else. The fundamental difference between German Nazi anti-Semitism and other forms of anti-Semitism is that Nazi anti-Semitism is sort of, first of all, it's kind of biological, it's pseudo-scientific, right? So it didn't matter if individual Jews converted or if their grandparents had converted to Christianity, they were still viewed by the Nazis as being, intrinsically, biologically Jewish. Whereas for other cultures, if you like, that wouldn't have been a problem. So it's kind of pseudo-scientific, it's biological, and secondarily, it's exterminatory. So it actually wants to exterminate them. It doesn't just want to sort of push them out, take them somewhere else, get them out of the way, make sure that they're not, economic competition or whatever reason it is. The Nazi ideology actually wants to exterminate them. So there are two fundamental differences. So really kind of comparing anti-Semitisms is a bit of a fool's game, because you can't compare much with Nazi anti-Semitism. It's a very particular thing. So yes, the short answer, there is anti-Semitism into all Poland, absolutely, but it's not of the Nazi sort, crucially. So there is going to be anti-Semitism within the Polish military. But that said, again, it's quite a melting pot. It actually works rather well. There's very little evidence I've seen of some real fundamental sort of racial and ethnic tensions within the Polish military in 1939 until the Soviet invasion, crucially. 17th of September, the Soviets invade eastern Poland in 39, and that's where a lot of those Belarusian and Ukrainian soldiers within the Polish army begin to kind of desert and begin to kind of think, well, maybe we should kind of vote with our feet, if you like. So you can see those tensions come to the fore there, but I've not really seen much in the way of anti-Semitic, fundamental anti-Semitic problems in the Polish army.
So, quick question. You were in Warsaw, weren't you, last week or the week before?
Week before, yeah.
At the Jewish cemetery, if I'm not mistaken.
That's right. Yeah, I did visit the Jewish cemetery, which is absolutely amazing, I have to say. I'd not been before. It's right next to Powązki, and so I've been to Powązki many times, which is the big, almost like the sort of the Highgate Cemetery of Warsaw. Where the Grave of the Good and all the generals are and all the rest of it. I've been to Powązki a few times. But literally the other side of the wall is the Jewish cemetery, which is just the most amazing place, and you can literally lose yourself in there.
We'll definitely get those photos up online. Moving on, we have a question from Wojtek. He says, Roger, in your book, do you describe the Polish Blitzkrieg, in inverted commas, carried out by General Roman Abraham, who made quick inroads into the German territory at the beginning of September 1939?
Yeah, this is what I call the Fraustadt raid. This was, yes, I do cover it in the book, is a short answer. This was a Polish attack into Silesia, actually, German province of Silesia, concentrating on the town of Fraustadt. And they did actually, they sent their, it was bicycle troops and cavalry, predictably, who sort of, conducted this lightning raid, and obviously found themselves between German armies, or somehow pretty much unopposed, and took quite a few German villages and towns before they retreated back again. This was on the 2nd of September. I think it's a very interesting episode, and it was reported in the Polish press at the time as being, look how great we are, we're taking the fight to the Germans. But I think we should be wary of kind of extrapolating from that and saying, this is what might have been possible, because I think it's kind of anomalous, effectively. So the Germans are attacking with much greater force than the Poles could muster at the time. There are greater numbers of everything, of trucks, of tanks, of aircraft, of men, even of horses. Now I make the point in the book that the Polish army is not the primitive beast that we think it is in 1939. It actually would stand up pretty well to most European armies. But the German army was the most advanced, both technologically, doctrinally as well, the Blitzkrieg doctrine as well. And in numbers, in sort of motorization and armor. So you know, they are fighting the most advanced military force on the planet in 1939, and that's what fundamentally explains their failure. But the Polish army is not, you know, as I say, it's not the sort of primitive antediluvian force that we think it is. It's much better equipped than that. It's much better at what it's doing than that. It's just up against a force that it was much better than it was.
We've actually got another question from Models TPS. We're going to take a slightly different direction.
Yeah.
So, had the Poles ignored the French and British requests to delay mobilisation, would that have helped getting the Polish troops in position earlier and provided for better battlefield communications, as they would have been set up?
Yeah, that's a good question. The British and the French prevailed upon the Poles to delay their mobilisation right at the end of August 39, for the bizarre reason that they were so desperate to try and maintain the peace. Of course, the peace was, you know, disappearing through their fingers at that point. But they were so desperate to try and preserve the peace that they wanted their allies, the Poles, basically not to do anything that could be construed as provocative to the Germans, bizarrely, right? So they prevailed upon them not to mobilise. So there's this sort of piecemeal mobilisation, a secret mobilisation that's partially done, and Polish forces are sort of mobilised to, you know, something like about 60 or 70%. So a lot of forces are incomplete. You know, they don't have their full complement of men and material. They're not necessarily in the right place where they should be. So this does really, you know, this does hamper Poland's preparations for the German attack on the 1st of September. But I think, again, to extrapolate from that and say that Poland might have, it certainly would have resisted better. I think that's obvious. It would have resisted a bit better, but whether that would have saved Poland's skin in 39, I very much doubt, because of that disparity that I mentioned just now. You know, they are fighting the most advanced and best equipped military force on the planet. So, you know, maybe that extra 30% of men and material would have made a difference, you know, maybe extended the campaign for a few weeks, but I really don't think it would have actually saved Poland's skin, unfortunately. So it's another one of those things that, you know, people often point to and say, well, maybe that could have made a difference. Yeah, it would have made a difference, but it wouldn't have changed the result. That's the problem.
Dominic Lipnicki has kind of on the same theme asked, could and should the Allies have done more to help Poland in 1939?
Yeah, I mean, that's another one of these, you know, big questions that I try and address in the book. I think we, in our Western narrative, we kind of view the Polish campaign a little bit in parentheses. So we kind of separate it out, and it's separate from our war. It happens over there in Eastern Europe, and it's a long way away. And it's, you know, to paraphrase, you know, Chamberlain when he was talking about you know, the Czech crisis of the previous year, it's a faraway place of which we know little, and we're not really that bothered about it. But if you look at it from the other perspective, which is what I try and do in the book, if you look at it from the Polish perspective, the September campaign is very much part of what they viewed as an inter-allied operation, right? So they viewed themselves as the allies of the British and the French, and they expected the British and the French to do something to help them. That's what those two allies had said they would do. So then when the British and the French effectively do nothing, and I will explain what they do in a minute, that is viewed in Poland with a considerable amount of dismay, to say the least. So the British, for example, there's limited bombing raids particularly on naval targets in the early, you know, first week or so of September 39. And they also carry out leafleting raids. So they drop about, you know, millions of, I think 12 million leaflets are dropped over Western Germany, basically imploring the German people to stop being so beastly to the Poles. All of which, of course, has very, very, very little effect whatsoever. The French are a bit more proactive, so they had promised to attack, you know, promised the Poles that they would attack on land, attack Western Germany. They start what's called the Saar offensive, I think from memory, on the 8th of September. They get about 5 kilometers into the Saarland, which is, you know, the sort of western tip of Western Germany. And at which point they kind of, you know, someone fires a rifle at them and they turn around and go home again. So it sort of redefines half-hearted. So both the British and the French, they're kind of going through the motions, but not actually doing anything of any substance at all. And my argument would be, if they're willing to go that far, they should have, if they'd done something with some real vigor behind them. If the British are willing enough to drop leaflets on Western Germany, they could, logistically and technologically, it would have been possible to drop bombs. And again, the French are invading Western Germany. Just do it with a bit more vigor and more armor and more personnel, and actually mean it. Now, had the British and the French actually done something vigorous in September 39, and I think, again, it could have had an effect, because it would have obliged the Germans to pull forces away from the Polish theatre to meet those threats in the West, right? So it would have lessened the pressure on the Poles. Again, I don't think it would have changed the end result of the September campaign. It might have extended it. It might have made it even more bloody than it was, and it's an extremely bloody campaign. But I don't think it would have changed the result. But it is still, that aside, it is still, I think, a sort of rather shameful episode in British and French history, because we did commit and promise to help the Poles in 39, and we did effectively nothing to meet that commitment. And I think that's rather shameful.
It does sound like quite the controversy. There's a lot of myths going around, and Roger, I was talking to Alina about this because I've heard lots of nonsense about this period. Yeah. She mentioned one in particular about the Polish cavalry charging at German tanks. Can you elaborate on this? And did it happen?
Yeah, this is one of those. This always comes up, and it's a sort of an old, historical canard. The myth of Poles charging German tanks. It's kind of gone down in history, really. It's something. It came essentially from German propaganda of the war. It became their dominant propaganda narrative. So it's a very easy way of them sort of telling the story of the war, and telling it in such a way as to make themselves look superior. So not only militarily superior, but obviously this is the Nazis we're talking about. So, by extension, racially superior as well. And the Poles, obviously, militarily and racially inferior to them. So that's the origin of it. Is it comes from German propaganda of the war, and then it's kind of been propagated ever since. Essentially, there's even the great Polish filmmaker Andrzej Wajda. I think his first film, actually, from the 1950s, about 1957. Was called Lotna, and there's a scene in that film which is of Polish cavalry charging German tanks, with sabers drawn and being mown down, and the few cavalrymen that actually get to the tanks kind of bash the top of the tanks with their sabers, and they're sort of they're surprised that they're actually made of metal, as if these people are complete fools and complete ignorant backwoodsmen. Now, so, this is something that has been propagated post-war as well. And we need to put this myth to bed, finally. It's 2020. We're now 80 years on from the events that the book describes. We need to put this sort of nonsense to bed. Polish cavalry was actually, the most advanced. It was the creme de la creme, really, of Polish forces in 39. Crucially, they fought dismounted, so they had actually, rewritten their modus operandi between the Napoleonic Wars and 1939. They fought dismounted. They used the horses effectively for mobility. They used to sort of tow these artillery pieces and so on behind them, put themselves into position. The horses would be taken away, and they were very effective fighters. You look at the story of battles, for example, the Battle of Mokra on the 1st of September, which I mentioned in the book, is a perfect example of how the Polish cavalry fought very well against German armour. They fought dismounted with anti-tank artillery and anti-tank rifles as well, and were very effective. Now, that said, there are examples where they did use a traditional, cavalry charge. Now, that wasn't their normal modus operandi in 1939, but they could still do it. They could still do it against infantry, for example. Can you imagine being an infantryman and being charged by cavalry? And you would, you'd have to change your trousers afterwards if you survived, because it would be terrifying. And it did work, right? So this actually worked very well in certain circumstances. But of course, the Germans, would sort of take those examples and say, these fools are attacking us on horseback, and we just have to mow them down because they're foolish Poles. So that's where the myth comes from. The history is always much more complicated than these sort of simplified mythologies. So there are examples of Poles charging, but they charge infantry. There's examples of cavalry on cavalry engagements in September 39. So again, the argument that the Germans are all in tanks and the Poles are all on horseback, again, it's nonsense. The Germans have more cavalry than the Poles do in 1939. So there's all sorts of nuances and sort of subtleties in this that we need to bring out. But fundamentally, the idea that the Poles charged German tanks in 1939 is nonsense, and we need to put it to bed.
There's quite a lot of these conspiracies and falsified things. I mean, Roger speaks about a lot of it in his book, but we could go on about this for ages, and the show would be 2 or 3 hours long. But unfortunately, we don't have 2 or 3 hours, however much we'd love to have Roger on. But I'd love for you to plug your book one last time before we do sign off. So please tell us a little bit about it.
Well, I kind of adumbrated, wonderful word, on a sunny day. I've foreshadowed all of the things that I sort of deal with in the book. I wanted to put the Polish campaign back on the historical map, as it were, because I think it has been ignored. It usually gets, a couple of pages in these standard histories, and you rarely hear a Polish voice, contemporary Polish voice in those sort of standard histories. So I wanted to rectify those omissions. I wanted to put it back on the map, and actually give the Poles back a voice in this narrative. And at the same time also to attack that mythology. So that mythology of, on the German side of cavalry against tanks, that old myth, and the Soviet side, and now the Russian side, courtesy of Putin, the idea that the Soviets didn't invade Poland at all in 1939, when they patently did. So this is another myth that Mr. Putin is now trying to resurrect. So that's another one that needs to be put to bed. And then also to sort of put it within that wider context, as I mentioned, to describe it as a sort of an Anglo-Polish, French, combined operation, which is how the Poles certainly viewed it. So there's a lot there that I wanted to try and do, but crucially it was to tell a really quite a ripping story. It's quite a fascinating story. There are lots of voices in there. There's lots of archival material, lots of first-hand material, diaries and interviews and so on. So there's no shortage of kind of human interest, to put it that way, in the book. And as I said, I've been told, and I hope it is. It's a sort of a gripping read. I had a very nice email from a reader the other day saying, pick this up during lockdown, and I can't put it down. It's brilliant, which is wonderful. It's lovely to hear that when you're a writer. So that's really, really gratifying. But I think more importantly, the historian in me, I do feel like I've sort of filled a gap, and I think that was an important gap to fill as well. So I heartily recommend it to all our listeners.
I totally and utterly agree. So, ladies and gentlemen, if you missed out on the title is First to Fight, The Polish War, 1939. You can get it on Amazon, your local bookstores. I think it's available in America now, isn't it?
It's coming out in May in America. If America is still alive in May, it's coming out there then, yeah.
Perfect. There's a Polish version as well that I've seen out here in the Polish shops. So if you want to pick up a Polish version. On that note, I'm going to pass you over to Alex because I want to find out who we've got tomorrow.
Thank you so much, Roger. That was fascinating. You've held my attention,
my pleasure.
Not only on World War II, but a sort of out there campaign in World War II the whole time you've been on, which is, as Alina will know, is an absolute miracle for me because it didn't involve singing and dancing or any slapstick comedy. So well done, and thank you very much. I look forward to reading it. Tomorrow you can join us to listen to us talk to Leslie Downer, who talks to us about Japanese history, her love for it, and where in Japanese history you should set your historical fiction. Until then, stay safe. If you can, stay at home. And this is Nighthawk signing off.